Hi, welcome to another episode of Hot Takes. Now, we're going to talk about a man called Gregor Smith. He is the Chief Medical Officer. He was basically Scotland's doctor during the pandemic. He was Nicola Sturgeon's go-to guy. Only one of them, of course, not the actual go-to guy. My God, no, he's an actual doctor. They don't want anything like that. He's Professor, Sir Gregor Smith. Anyway, he was being questioned at the UK COVID inquiry towards the end of last week. And he was talking about a conversation he had with Gillian Higgins back in 2020. Now, the conversation was regarding PPE and DNRs, do not resuscitate orders. And he admitted that he probably didn't perform very well in that meeting. He said he wasn't on his game at the time. And so things were said that perhaps shouldn't have been said. Now, I think the problem he's got is that what he said is, first of all, problematic in and of itself, but also could, I think, lead to maybe a class action against the SNP government. And of course, if it's a health and safety issue, it's not just against the government, it's against all the individuals on an individual basis. That's where health and safety lands. It's not something that just stops at a corporate level. But he said there had been no review into the DNA CPR, do not attempt CPR, or do not resuscitate notices. It hadn't been applied in Scotland. There'd been no investigation. It had in England, but not in Scotland. It was just slapped on without anyone really thinking about it or working out what the implications were. And the implications were many people died unnecessarily or against their will. Sometimes, as we know, we've spoken to Leslie, that her mother, for example, had a DNR put on not against her will so much, but outside of her knowledge. And so, guarantee that wasn't the only one. There would have been many people there who had DNRs put on and nobody discussed it. So it was there. He was then questioned about why between July 20 and December 20, there was no clinical guidance on long COVID, and why didn't the Scottish government put specialist funding in place for this guidance? He said he didn't really have an answer to that. It wasn't his department, but certainly it would have something he would have thought should have been done and mentioned it, but it was never taken up. So basically, again, saying that those in power went against his advice. It's very damaging. He had admitted after that period he had no idea what was going on because nobody was talking to him. Nobody from government was starting to include him. He would become problematic in being, someone who told the government what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. That's the big difference. Now, this is the next bit I want to just mention here is very worrying because we know those little papery masks that they have, they're not PPE. They were passed off as PPE, but they're not PPE. Indeed, when you look at the box, it actually says on the box, not PPE. And he was confronted with the damning evidence of this. And for those, for the use of those which weren't PPE, but also for PPE, actual PPE, the PPE3 stuff, that was out of date and therefore, again, not legal. And why wasn't it upgraded? They're saying the masks had a fail rate of 75%. Why weren't they upgraded? Why weren't they given the new stuff? Why were they just given rubbish? They were saying that even those little paper masks that they were handing out often were so old, the elastic had withered and would just snap when they were trying to put it on. And they're saying these were obvious dangers. And why weren't they upgraded to actual PPE? And he said, well, it wasn't worth it. His words. He said that they would, if they were to go and use proper PPE, the cost itself would have been prohibitive. They were going to go through 5,000 to 10,000 of those masks, proper PPE masks, a week. Said the cost would have been prohibitive, and of course it would have been unnecessary for most people. Think about this: if actual proper PPE was, in the doctor's words, unnecessary for most people, then why was non-PPE stuff forced on everybody? You can see how this stinks. This stinks like week-old fish, doesn't it? And he said that there was a complete lack of acknowledgement anywhere in government that these things were happening. Nobody was taking responsibility. He said, we knew that the equipment we were handing out was either not PPE, was out-of-date PPE, or was the wrong PPE. And it was very rare that they actually had legal, actual, proper PPE. He said, and the reason, of course, as I mentioned, was one of cost. So people died because it was just too expensive to keep them alive. Isn't this weird? He said that the chief medical officer stated that while protecting staff was important, the Scottish government did not wish to overreact by implementing the advice given to them by medical professions. So medical professionals tell you what to do, and you consider that an overreaction as the government. So, Sturgeon and Freeman were sitting there going, oh, we can't do that. That's an overreaction. They didn't want to give them protection of a higher standard, or at least of a suitable standard. I mean, not protecting the actual workforce is a crime. The health and safety law is very, very is very, very clear on this, I should say. Not giving the adequate and correct PPE to staff is a crime. And it's a crime both at the corporate and the personal level. Freeman ultimately is responsible. She's the minister. She is personally responsible for this. It's unbelievable, isn't it? That they just couldn't see what was happening. Or worse, they could see and chose to go a different route. That's worse. But he's saying that these things were difficult times. He was having difficult meetings. He's saying nobody was listening to him, or if they were listening to him, they weren't acting on what he was saying. And then the big news in 2020, of course, was when the WHO said as a fact that COVID was not airborne. And at that moment, bang, all those masks were meaningless. They were always useless, but now they were meaningless. And yet they still kept them on. They actually caused more problems because of the regurgitation of the moist air back in, causing things like pneumonia. This is what happens when political ideology overrides common sense, expert opinion, and medical advice. And at that moment, it becomes a criminal matter, and those responsible need to be prosecuted. Thank you very much. Goodbye.